Good morning to some of you, good afternoon to others of you. Welcome to our next webinar in the Public Safety Innovation Series. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Ari Vidali. I am the founder and CEO of Envisage Technologies. I'll be one of your co-hosts for today.
And I'm Chris Arterberry, also of Envisage Technologies, your other co-host. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we start. First, our session today will run at most 1 hour, approximately 45 minutes of presentation and 15 minutes for Q&A. Please feel free to enter questions at any time into the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen, and we will answer those later in the session. And then second, we're recording the webinar today so that you'll be able to watch it again or share it with others, and we'll send you information about that in the near future.
Okay, Ari again here. Before we get started, a little bit about us, Envisage Technologies. We are a leader in training and compliance technology for public safety professionals. In short, we design technology that ensures that our first responders are trained, equipped, and ready. With over 1.3 million first responders using our technology around the country, we started this webinar series because we were frustrated that great ideas and best practices, those that really can save lives, are not getting out there and being adopted fast enough. We're really passionate about solving that for public safety and raising the bar on training. We believe that readiness saves lives and are committed to improving public safety through awareness and innovation. Today, we introduce the first webinar in a three-part series on a very important topic, that of high-stakes testing. We know that the fire industry has a large challenge when it comes to testing, and it makes it even more of a challenge when you have some people out there who want to cheat the system. Now, this is not simply a matter of someone getting away with something. It's about money, the integrity of public safety, but most of all, it's about ensuring that all of those firefighters that are standing on the line are ethical and have all the skills, knowledge, and abilities that they need to do the job safely. In other words, it's about saving lives. And that's something that is often overlooked when we talk about cheating as it relates to testing. Unfortunately, you've seen the headlines. Recent cheating incidents involving public safety professionals serve as a reminder that testing procedures simply have not kept pace with advances in technology. Our speakers today will discuss these scandals, describe how agencies are reacting, and explain the waves of litigation that cheating can create. Next week, we will show you how you can strengthen the integrity of the testing process and greatly reduce the likelihood that cheating occurs. In our final webinar of the series, we will then explain what you need to know before you invest in testing software as a solution to this issue.
And with that, we'll introduce today's speakers. Gerry Roberts, JD, is legal counsel for Envisage Technologies and member of the Indiana State Bar Association. He's worked at the Indiana Office of the Attorney General, the Denton County District Attorney Office in Texas, and the Dallas Public Defender's Office. Gerry's also served as an administrative law judge. An acclaimed writer on the broad topic of legal concerns for public safety, Gerry's published several articles and white papers regarding training standards, minimizing litigation costs, and creating legally defensible records for public safety professionals. Fire Chief Clive Savacool has been in the fire service since 1996. He's held many positions including firefighter, paramedic, engineer, captain, training chief, battalion chief, and vice president for the Firefighters Union. Unfortunately, busy call volume and years of toxic exposures resulted in permanent respiratory damage. In 2014, Clive left the fire service to improve his health and subsequently founded Exposure Tracker, which tracks toxic exposure, injuries, and communicable disease exposure for firefighters. The program has been adopted by hundreds of firefighters and a number of agencies. Clive is now fire chief for the Garden Valley Fire Protection District in Northern California. Gerry, Clive, thanks for being here with us today.
Well, thanks, Ari and Chris, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to everyone for joining us in this first in series of 3 webinars on testing in the fire service. As Ari and Chris mentioned, today we're discussing one of the biggest hurdles in testing that departments face from both an operational and a legal standpoint, cheating. We'll discuss not only the numerous ways that cheating can hurt your department, but we'll also look to trends in cheating from recent high-profile cases, and we're going to try to distill some best practices from those. Even though our focus today is going to be on recent examples and preventative measures going forward, we shouldn't overlook the fact that cheating on tests is a problem as old as high-stakes testing itself. History tells us that at least as far back as 606 AD, there was rampant cheating on Chinese civil service exams. But equally enlightening is that the problem of cheating cannot simply be solved with investigations and punishments after the fact, because cheating persisted on these civil service exams despite the penalty of death. So instead, if time has taught us anything, it's that there needs to be a careful blend of preventative and remedial measures to ensure testing integrity. But while cheating has been around for more than a millennium, departments today face a much tougher task with prevention, with detection, and enforcement, because information is now easier to share than ever before. With the overwhelming majority of firefighters owning a smartphone, the answer to any question is potentially just a call, a Google search, a message, or a vibration, we'll talk more about that later, away. Equally problematic is that the costs of cheating are on the rise. While the cheater may rationalize to himself that cheating is a victimless crime, we've heard that before, right? Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, I would posit, and case law really supports this notion, that just about everybody is victimized by cheating. First, and perhaps most obvious, is the impact to those who do not cheat. For some, the artificially high scores of their peers means that they're not selected for a promotion or position. And even for those peers that do earn high scores on their own, one of the key effects of a cheating scandal is that there tend to be hiring freezes in their wake, because officials have to sort out what happened, who were the culpable parties, how are they going to respond, and meanwhile the courts have to sort through what are the available remedies for the non-cheaters. So to illustrate what the remedies are for the non-cheaters, in one scandal out of Atlanta, 173 firefighters were not promoted because of the cheating scandal, and they won the right not only to retake the test, but also to have their substantial class action legal fees paid by the city. This doesn't include typical settlement costs, or if you lose, damage awards. Therefore, we see our first trickle-down effects to the public, because they're the ones who have to pick up that tab. The public also suffers, of course, when firefighters lack the skills or the expertise that they need to respond to an emergency, and they end up causing harm to people or property as a result. While firefighters often have some level of legal immunity, sometimes it's based in statute, sometimes it's based in common law, for their actions, even their negligent actions, while they're fighting fires, that immunity might be undermined or it might be circumvented in instances where they've taken some sort of deliberate action that causes harm. Cheating can be that deliberate act. Whether or not there is individual liability, though, as the entity with deeper pockets, the employing agency is often going to be named in the lawsuit and forced to actually pay the costs. Therefore, we get this unusual situation in which agencies are actually tasked with defending the actions of cheating firefighters in litigation by the aggrieved public. And it's not just litigation from non-cheaters and public that the departments need to watch out for, because some of the longest and honestly the most expensive lawsuits are those that are actually filed by the alleged cheaters. Depending on how the department arrived at its judgment that cheating occurred and how they publicize that information, cheaters could allege defamation, whether by libel or slander, however you do it, and they can seek reinstatement or lost wages or legal fees because they're denied that job or promotion. Even when these cases are settled out of court, which happens often, they usually take years to resolve, and as a result, they incur hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, not to mention lost productivity. In just a case filed last week, this is happening all the time, last week, 4 firefighters out of Virginia Beach filed suit because the battalion chief allegedly gave critical test information to 2 firefighters on the annual captain's exam. In that case, they're not even seeking monetary compensation. They just want a second and fair chance at taking the exam. And while this might be perceived internally in that organization as maybe a cost savings because they're not going to have to worry about damages, those inside the department have noted, quote, the ramifications of this will last for years. And even though the incident happened last year, they said, quote, it still affects morale to this day and is the #1 topic of conversation at all of the firehouses. So, Clive, would you say that this human toll, this impact on morale, is pretty universal when it comes to cheating? And are there any other costs that you perceive?
Yeah, thank you, Gerry. So the morale is a huge impact because you have, and I'll use myself an example. When I was promoting to engineer, it took a lot of time preparing for this test, a lot of work, including my family having to deal with me when I'm doing all this testing and studying. And the test ended up getting thrown out because of 2 individuals that filed a lawsuit. And whether or not they were right, the test was thrown out. So 20 or so of us that were on this promotional list were now denied a promotion. And so the morale took a huge hit, and not just to us, but then there was the cynicism from everybody else in the organization saying, look what happened to these guys on top of the 2 individuals that they felt might have been wronged. And so the morale took a huge hit in our organization, and it took a while to rebuild. So the morale takes a huge hit, but then the costs also skyrocket. And so in some cases, the individuals are taken off work on administrative leave while the investigation is conducted. So now there's overtime costs they're incurring, and it can be over $1,000 a shift just to cover that individual's shift on top of the salary that they're entitled to during the investigation, because we can't just all of a sudden say we're not paying you while this is occurring. And then you have to look at the legal costs. The agency I'm at now, we use outside legal, and so it costs me $300 an hour every time I bring them in on an issue. And as you know, these cases can take hundreds of hours to litigate. So there's huge costs that can skyrocket on top of any kind of settlement that might be awarded. So not doing your proper preparation for the test can result in extremely high costs.
This is admittedly a very real and a very consequential problem. But I think that there are insights we can take away from the fact that this is not a unique problem to the fire service, illustrating how the methods of cheating have really evolved in other areas of public safety. Less than 10 years ago, police officers in Pennsylvania were decertified after sharing an answer key with each other through a CD-ROM. Okay, everybody remembers CD-ROM. In another case out of Pennsylvania just 5 years later, though, that same type of sharing was occurring via text message. The officers were caught because there's this digital paper trail that's left behind. They did not delete the messages. But now fast forward to present day, right? And there are any number of similar messaging capabilities that leave no such evidence behind. One could easily Snapchat a photo of a question or an answer to a friend and set the message to self-destruct 5 seconds later, or however Snapchat works, right? It's becoming more and more difficult to detect these things. It's also important to note that cheating doesn't always occur in private or just between friends. Sometimes there's a big collective effort. There's been at least one high-profile scandal per year in policing where recruits or new officers compile their collective knowledge into study guides using actual exam materials, which is the key. Sometimes it actually persists over a number of years as well, so one class will pass on the materials to the next class. It's important to know, though, that this is not just happening at the lower levels of an organization. In one case, a high-ranking correctional officer used a proxy to complete required coursework that he needed to maintain his position. So whether we see the cheating come from the top down or in reverse, this pervasive disregard for testing integrity creates a culture of cheating that can really ruin morale. So Clive, can you tell us a little bit more about the culture of cheating and when cheating is most likely to occur? I know that you've had some great insight before about using proxies on open book tests and take-home assignments.
Yeah, so the couple examples that come to mind for the proxy side. One was a take-home test for captain position, promotional position, and it was take-home assignment where it was pretty much an essay form, and the proctors basically understood that there might be a certain level of cheating because when you have that many people taking a promotional exam, you can't expect everyone to be on the honor system for a take-home test. And so they would build the tests to be able to still learn the depth of knowledge of the individual, but still, when you have a take-home test, there's huge vulnerabilities for cheating. The one occasion that I used it was for a lateral promotional position for a training captain when I was a training chief, and so only captains were eligible. And so because it wasn't an upward promotion, I wasn't under the same civil service rules when doing the test. And so you have to know those rules when you're doing these promotional exams. So for my test, I gave them a lot of preparation assignments as far as a presentation that they had to conduct in front of the interview panel. And so even though I knew they might get help putting it together, my goal was to gauge how much effort they're going to put into to prepare for this position. And so based on my kind of excessive requirements for the testing interview process, even if they did do some cheating and had some help on it, I still knew if they did a good presentation that they were going to put some effort into this position. And so that way, my test would still bring out the best candidates.
So in a lot of ways, it's really about what you're trying to test. So taken straight from the headlines, we can easily find parallels between all of these examples from other public safety entities and ones that are in the fire service. In Northport, Florida, firefighters lost their jobs after they created a study guide of known testing material about EMS protocol. In Los Angeles County, there was an audit when they found that an unusually high number of family members were being hired and promoted. And they found that it was because there was unauthorized distribution of questions and answers between family and friends. 50 people were implicated in that process. In Montgomery, Alabama, officials reported that a test for recruits was completely compromised. Everybody knew the questions and answers, requiring at least 7 dismissals from the academy. In New York City, a man was found accessing an answer key on his phone in the bathroom. And based on reports from the Sacramento Bee, a panelist for CAL FIRE allegedly was sharing questions and answers with a candidate, which meant that 488 applicants would have been forced to retake the exam, if not for the union's intervention. This was part of a larger investigation which led to 16 employees being fired, demoted, or resigning for illicit activities, which included cheating. So while each of these departments has received a certain level of backlash from the public for these cheating incidents, I do think that it's important to recognize that these reports surfaced and they were punished and there was transparency because the organizations are trying to maintain a high level of integrity within their organization and they're trying to deal with this problem. So Clive, would you agree that it can actually be a good sign when these organizations make headlines for cheating and they're so transparent about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things on the agency side to make sure they have proper messaging when these incidents occur. And anytime they have an incident occur, they should have preparation in case it hits the media. That way they can respond appropriately quickly. And I can attest to the CAL FIRE example. The CAL FIRE, who I work very closely with, is an organization of very high integrity and very high standards. And using their promotional process as an example, they have to have multiple test sites throughout the entire state just because they have such a large number of employees. And so when they have a test, they have to be extremely consistent. And so back to your question, when they do have an incident occur such as this, when it does hit the press, they use that opportunity to talk about their integrity, talk about not letting anything slip through the cracks, and they hold people accountable. And so when something like this occurs, they don't mess around. Those individuals are terminated, and they keep the high bar of standards in their organization, and they show the public their high level of integrity. And so I think CAL FIRE has done a great job of that.
Excellent. So these situations are obviously challenging, but in a way you need to look at it like an opportunity. So as an example of what happens when organizations aren't as focused on transparency and aren't doing these things, there's a decade-old case from FDNY. There were reports of widespread cheating on an entrance exam, but they were largely ignored, and they came to light only years later during a minority discrimination lawsuit where they proved to be very, very relevant. And here I think it's important to note that discrimination lawsuits often go hand in hand with cheating. There's a case from Cleveland in which black firefighters were alleging that there was racial bias on promotional exams. whereas white firefighters were complaining that they had been improperly labeled as cheaters and that they were slandered in depositions. I also know of at least one study that found more than half of civil lawsuits against firefighters are related to employment issues like discrimination. So, Clive, would you say that discrimination needs to be on your mind from beginning to end, from test creation to administration to investigation, all the way through discipline?
Yeah, absolutely. The going back to the perception side of things, the organizers of the test may not have any malintent at all, but if they're not checking over the test very thoroughly for fairness and making sure that no protected class is going to feel that they're being mistreated, they're opening themselves up to huge litigation. And so that's why it's very important when you're putting these tests together to make sure you run them through your legal department, run them through your human resources department. If you're using an outside consultant to run your testing process, they have some protections they put in place. And so making sure the protected classes are treated completely fair will not only help the test not be litigated, but it will deter people from feeling like they were mistreated in the first place.
It makes sense. And so, Clive, we've talked about using proxies and we've talked about study guides. What other examples do you know of? Have we captured every type of cheating in the fire service?
There's always new and creative ways that are coming about, especially with technology. And so you really want to control the way the test is conducted. Sharing is probably the most common method of cheating. As you mentioned, proctors sometimes share cheating. That comes into play during the investigation, where if one example you mentioned was with a proctor with CAL FIRE, and so if they're texting information, those phones from that chief belong to the organization, so they're allowed to look at them and see if there was any cheating going on. The internet is obviously a huge source of information, so if you're using a test maybe that comes out of an IFSTA manual, because they do put together tests based on their curriculum, that information you have to expect the candidates might be reviewing if it's on the internet. And so there's a lot of different ways for cheating. That's why it always goes back to having your test as tight as possible when preparing it.
Makes sense. So what else can we take away from these cases? Perhaps most enlightening, at least to me, is how the cheaters were caught and what remedial measures their departments took afterward to prevent reoccurrence. In some cases, cheaters were caught red-handed with illicit materials, or they were discovered using the assistance of a proxy during the exam. They decided to card somebody and it turns out they're not who they said they were. Or perhaps they confessed to their misdeeds without any prompting whatsoever. Their conscience was weighing on them. But while these might be the most surefire ways to establish that cheating has occurred, such instances are understandably rare, right? More often, departments are left to rely on the reports of fellow test takers, of whistleblowers, right? Because these folks are understandably upset about the unfair advantage that some of their peers are getting. When administrators are notified that cheating might occur ahead of time, there are a lot of measures that they can take to establish that cheating occurred after the fact. For instance, if they have access to more than one test bank, or even a randomized sequence of the same test bank, just on a different form, they can switch it out at the last moment. So for those who were relying solely upon the services of an answer key, you can easily show the differences in scores had the original version been used instead. For instance, if my multiple choice answers match up 100% with the first test version, but then somehow I only score 32% because I used those same A, B, C, D answers on the second test form, that evidence is fairly damning that I was just relying on an answer key. Of course, most firefighters pick up on the fact that their answer key isn't aligning to the actual question. Not all questions are created equal. Some are more difficult than others, and for the easy questions, they can easily see that B doesn't match up with what they thought it was going to be. So, at some point in time during testing, for those who are relying on answer keys, they go back and change their answers. So some folks end up getting caught through eraser analysis. This is where they look at eraser marks on physical exams, but there's also ways of doing it digitally. Find out what answers were changed and ask why they were changed, usually at the beginning of a test. But of course, to discourage cheating altogether, some departments have focused on drafting new questions for each test that are only going to be used once. But of course, this can be a really labor-intensive and expensive proposition. So Clive, I know that you had some important insight here regarding how you focus on depth of knowledge to avoid cheating on promotional tests without having to necessarily recreate the test every single time.
Sure. We always look at the previous test to see how it was conducted, what changes we can make. We try not to recycle any specific test questions that they might be prepared for. So what we do is we build the test to identify their depth of knowledge, so that if we ask them a question on how would they handle a center hallway apartment complex fire, that's a very specific type of fire that's very deadly, potentially for both victims and firefighters. And so even if they know that question is coming, their proctors are still going to be able to examine the candidate's depth of knowledge on their answer. And if there's any kind of follow-up questions that the proctors are allowed to ask, they could pry even deeper into the depth of knowledge. And so if you build your test and you design it based off the position and depth of knowledge versus looking for absolute black and white answers, you're going to be able to still have the best candidates rise to the top.
Makes sense. So of course, some incidents of cheating don't come to light until after it occurs, in which case it can be much more difficult to not only prove, but to punish. Aside from the testimony of classmates, these whistleblowers, some departments have used comparative analysis tools to look at performance on previous exams, or they will conduct retesting when there's suspicious scores. But the problem with this approach, of course, is that some people genuinely perform better on some tests than others. They prepare more for one than necessarily for another one. And of course, conducting retests is expensive and potentially subjects your department to discrimination claims because you're treating some people differently than others. So I think our main takeaway is that departments need to be really proactive rather than reactive to cheating. And the first step in doing that is to establish policies and procedures around the reporting, around the investigation, and around the consequences for cheating. Because if you do this well, you're not only going to encourage the reporting of incidents, you'll give people a method for doing that, you'll also ensure that cheaters are duly punished, whether you don't allow them to reapply or make a lateral transfer. But more importantly, since you're following the same set of rules for everybody that were set ahead of time, these policies and procedures allow you to defeat nearly all discrimination claims. So Clive, would you agree that it all starts with policies and procedures and that you need to set those things to really control the environment and control the test?
Absolutely. That's really where it comes down to preventing cheating, is controlling the test environment. And so there's a number of different ways. Obviously, as a test organizer, you don't want to allow any kind of phones. Another process that we've always used is we don't use the names of the candidates or the proctors, and we bring in proctors from other agencies. This has become a very common practice. And so when we do a promotional test and a captain candidate goes in to see an interview panel, they don't know any of the panelists, and the panelists don't know them. And so before the test, we'll bring in a sheet of the names of the candidates, and we'll ask the proctors, do you know any of these candidates? And then we'll do the same thing with the candidates for the proctors. And none of them want to get caught lying. And so that's a great way for us to be able to have a very neutral and unbiased exam. And the other benefit is if those proctors already know the candidates, then there might be some preconceived notions, even if it's subconscious, which might affect their scoring. So we tried to have every candidate and proctor not know one another. The other benefit that we do is we'll keep the candidates after the test for half hour or hour for a debrief on the test material. That way, right after the test is done, they're not running out to their car to take notes or call their friends. Again, going back to not recycling material, we try to come up with new ways, new types of test questions, even if it's just a little bit different. That way, anybody that took notes from the previous test isn't going to pass that on. And then the final step is we try to minimize all the hands that the material goes through. And so if we have a promotional exam that's an assessment center, there might be 6 different stations. Well, only the people on the role play scenario know the content of that material. So that if the people on the interview panel might know somebody on the candidate side, they're not going to be able to pass on any information. So even if you have a proctor that's wanting to share information, they're only going to be able to share it for their one station. And so by controlling the number of hands that the material goes through, not only does it prevent or minimize the cheating, but also if their test is compromised and you conduct an investigation, it's easier to narrow down where that information might have come from. So there's really a number of different ways to control the site, but that's really the key to having a tight testing process.
I think those are all really great takeaways. And I found it interesting that when you bring in these outside proctors and you remove names from tests, it's not only a good practice from an operational standpoint, but also from a legal one, because it really helps defeat those claims of bias. You remove that entirely from the testing instrument, from the instrumentation. It's just great. So I know that Ari is going to dive deeper into some technology-based methods of preventing cheating during the next webinar, so I'm not going to spoil his fun. But suffice it to say that there are solutions to help departments keep up with cheaters in the age of information. Just as an example, when you have proxies sit in for exams, that's much harder to do when you send people to an off-site location that's managed by a third party. It's much harder to regulate that because these folks at the third-party site, they don't know, they don't recognize your folks, and it's easier to let these cheaters slip through the cracks. My final thought for today is that testing and cheating is not a unique problem for the fire service. We talked about its impact on public safety, but it extends elsewhere as well. And so I'd encourage you to look to other industries to see how they've addressed this problem. As an example, I am a competitive chess player. And since Deep Blue beat Gerry Kasparov in the mid-1990s, computers have been the best players in the world, hands down. And with millions of dollars in prize money on the line at tournaments around the world every year, many predicted the end of competitive chess as we knew it, because it was going to be undermined by computer cheating. And these predictions were not entirely unfounded, especially now that smartphones can run apps that are capable of beating the best players in the world. The temptation has now met up with the ability to cheat. And for some, this temptation and ability has just been too much to handle. People have been caught hiding their phones in the bathroom, inside of toilets, or even programming an app to run in their shoes. And then they would rely on toe taps and vibrations back from the phone to determine best moves. So like firefighting, there have been issues with proxies as well, because in chess, practically no player is required to provide ID at open tournaments. Some have also used accomplices. They've sent signals through carefully concealed hearing aids, through wires, or even elaborate schemes. And it's not too far to imagine that this could happen in the fire service as well. In one notable scandal, the French national team established a network of cheating where they would have spectators walk past the game, and then they would send a move to somebody off-site that was operating a very strong computer. They would receive the best move back via a text message, and then that spectator would go stand somewhere in the room. Then the player playing the game would find where in the room that person is, and they'd lock on, and they'd say, okay, because they're in that spot, I'm going to make this move. They only got caught, though, because of an elaborate series of text messages sent back and forth. And we've mentioned that, this paper trail and digital paper trail is becoming increasingly thin. So, despite these hurdles and the elaborate schemes that people are willing to go through, somehow cheating hasn't ruined chess yet. Prize funds and participation are higher than ever, and these cheating incidents are relatively few and far between as far as we know. How? How have they done it? What can we take away for the fire service? Number one, as Clive has mentioned, they control the environment. It is very important to control the environment. Before people go into high-stakes chess tournaments, they have searches and metal detectors. And what do? They confiscate things like cell phones, things that are actually capable of providing assistance. But not just cell phones, because we live in a day and age where people also have smart watches. You can receive text messages, all sorts of information on your wrist, and those types of things don't typically get picked up at the beginning of a test. Aside from phones and watches, there are also smart pens these days. And so it's not a bad practice if you're going to be running a test to take away pens as well and to provide those on site, because smart pens can look things up on the internet, can receive messages, they can have voice, Bluetooth connectivity, so somebody off-site can be connecting with them. There's too many technological solutions out there for you to just leave that out in the open. Another way that chess has really dealt with this is by increasing their methods of detection, right? One way they've done this is they've been able to compare games after the fact with what the perfect moves would have been in that situation. How does this apply to the fire service? Well, if your class averages a 95% on one exam, when previous classes were only averaging a 70% on the exam, that's maybe something worth investigating. You're comparing something previous to something new. Something else they've done for chess is they've done live detection of move time. In any given chess game, there are moments that don't require a ton of calculation. You have to recapture a piece. You have to get out a check, and you do it relatively quickly. But a cheater will actually just move things at a pretty consistent basis, 5 seconds or 10 seconds per move, right? You might have a similar situation in the fire service where some questions are necessarily more difficult than others and require more thought. Yet, if somebody's giving the same amount of time per question, perhaps that's indicative of cheating. So the final note that I'll have here about chess and how it can really impact things is the way that they've dealt with it punishment-wise. By and large, anybody who's been caught cheating at a chess tournament has received some sort of ban, whether for a number of years or for a lifetime. And I think this has done a lot to discourage things. So, Clive, is this even a feasible option for fire?
So a ban from a test or promotion is pretty tough, and it's going to vary state to state based off your labor laws. California, as an example, we can't prevent somebody from retaking a promotional exam. And so when we've had captains that were demoted to firefighters, we can't tell them part of your punishment is you cannot take a promotional exam. It's just not legal. You know, if they're part of a civil service position, they're entitled to take that promotion. So if that's your goal, then it's probably best to seek termination. It's going to really base on what crime or violation was committed, but we cannot prevent a person from promoting or taking the test. Now, we can sometimes control the actual promotion. So they might take the test, come out number one on the promotional list, but we might have the right to pass them over. Now, some organizations, they have rules called rule of the list, which means, no, you have to go down the list and promote in that order. And if that's the case, if that's the policy for your agency, then you're stuck. You have to promote them. And then it comes into play of your probationary process and how you might test them during that probation to get them to either change their ways or fail. But having a lifetime ban is pretty difficult. And we also have to look at the Firefighter Bill of Rights when it comes to the investigation of these. So lifetime bans aren't necessarily an option, at least not in California.
That makes sense. And I think that's very important that you point this out, because obviously our focus today has been on strategies for preventing and dealing with cheating. But as you point out, there's always other considerations. There's legal considerations, there's operational ones, what your policies say, what legal says for your department. And so those things have to be weighed. It's obviously important to deal with cheating, but it should never just be the only concern in your mind. You've got to think about these other things as well. So, Clive, do you have any other final thoughts for us?
Yeah, a couple different things. One is the perception. It's important to remember that the cheating can go both ways. It's not just on the subordinate side trying to promote. I've seen tests where the fire chief actually wanted a specific person for a promotional position, and so when the test was put out there, the assessment center parameters were all geared towards this one individual's current position, and so they were testing everybody on, for example, the public information officer side of things, which this one individual was the agency's public information officer. So it was very clear to everybody that the fire chief wanted this individual for the position, and because that agency had the rule of the list, meaning the chief could pick whoever he wanted, we all knew who was going to get promoted, and that was the person that was promoted, even though they didn't come out number one on the list. And so everybody in the agency then felt, okay, the chief is going to do what he wants, and so if I have to cheat, then I'm going to cheat. And so you have to look at the perception and how there's going to be a ripple effect, because it does work both ways. And then my final thought, and really this is important, and it shows great leadership in the organization, is if you build a mentoring culture for your agency, have a career development plan. I can tell you when I promoted the battalion chief, I was given a badge and some car keys. That was my preparation, aside from what I did on my own. So the organization at the time didn't have anything. When I then took over as training chief, we organized the Captain's Academy that we sent every single captain in the organization through. And so we built this mentoring program in the agency. And so if you build this culture of mentoring and having people prepare for the position, then when you actually do have a promotional exam, they look at it as their time to shine and to show the knowledge that they've imparted. And so there's a lot less chance of cheating because they weren't just given what the test was going to be on 2 months before the test occurs. They've been preparing for this from the day one that they started the academy with their agency. So build this culture of mentoring and show that strong leadership, and it will help on all sides when it comes to cheating. Other than that, just thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here, Clive. So with that, we'd like to thank everyone again for joining us today and invite you, of course, to the second part of our series next week. But now, Clive and I will answer any questions that you might have. So if you have any questions, Chris, can you direct them how to submit those?
Yeah, in the lower left corner of your screen, you'll be able to open up a chat box and ask questions there. So we'll tackle those as they come in here for just a bit. Got one question here for you guys. What level of discipline do you recommend for people caught cheating?
I'll field that one. So depending on the organization, that severity might vary, but typically termination is pretty common for someone getting caught cheating, because cheating is essentially lying, which is the worst thing you can do in public safety. Once you lie, then it really discredits your integrity, and it's really hard to keep you in that position. Even really comes into play with law enforcement, because when their case goes to court, if they've ever been caught lying, it really comes out to play, and every defense attorney is going to bring it up. And so cheating is usually a fireable offense. And one experience that I had that I really should bring up, because it's the reality, is when it's a protected class that you're moving towards termination. One case we had in the past is we were told by legal that we were probably going to lose in arbitration. So even if this person was terminated, we were probably going to lose, and we were told we were likely to be sued civilly individually. And so we came to an agreement, and the person was just demoted. It was kind of like a plea bargain. And so you have to take all these things into account, but usually termination is the result for cheating.
And I just, if I may, have two additional points on that. Number one is, whatever method that you use, make sure that it's consistent with your previous policies, because again, if you're treating people differently every single time, then at some point in time that's going to come to a head, and somebody's going to allege that they're being treated differently because of a protected characteristic. And so make sure however you're dealing with it, it's in line with your policies. Make sure that that's there. I do not remember the second point, though, so any other questions?
Yeah, we've got another one for you. At what point do you get legal involved during the disciplinary process for cheating?
I'll start out with that one again, too. So I like to have them involved from the beginning of the testing process, just to have things thrown by them. Keep in mind that legal is going to go on the conservative side, and so that isn't just a factor in thinking, okay, they're just being conservative. It's also a factor that if you go against legal, like say they they tell you, no, you shouldn't do the test this way. Keep in mind, if you go against legal, that could come out later and make you more vulnerable to litigation because their defense is going to be, well, you went against your own lawyer's advice. But that being said, anytime you're doing the investigation side, which is very critical to do it right, a lot of discipline that I've seen get overturned wasn't because they found the person didn't commit the infraction. It was because something in the process wasn't followed correctly. I've seen people get their jobs back simply because the process wasn't followed correctly. So before any actual action is taken, I always bring in legal and I run it by them. That way we have all of our checks and balances covered.
I think that's a great point. And obviously, as a lawyer, my answer is going to be involve attorneys early and often. But really, it's a lot cheaper and a lot better for your organization when you involve lawyers from the beginning of a problem as opposed to only bringing them in at the end. Obviously, that's going to be an important step as well, but you'll save a lot of headaches, a lot of money if you involve them from the very beginning in crafting your policies, in educating your organization, as opposed to only doing problem solving at the end. Obviously, lawyers are expensive at every level, and so investing those sorts of resources on the front end is never an easy sell. But if you think about things in the long term, it is a lot easier to process those on the front end than the back end.
Great, thanks, guys. I've got another one here. Do you believe this is a more prevalent issue during promotional exams with experienced personnel or exams within an introductory academy with new personnel?
I'll start out that I think it's more prevalent with promotions just because usually they're multi-day, whereas entry-level positions usually it's one day for the written test. Even if they have multiple sites and multiple test times, it's usually just conducted on one day, and there might be fewer people that know each other taking that test versus everybody in a promotional exam knows one another. Also, there might be fewer components to a entry-level exam. You're going to have the written test, the physical agility test, and the interview process. And so there's less opportunity, I think, to cheat with entry-level versus promotional, where you've got the notification for the test, you're giving what the test might be taken or tested on several months prior to it, and then the candidates all know one another. So they might have a preconceived plan on how they're going to cheat. So I think it's more prevalent on the promotional exams from my personal experience.
Yeah, I think it's going to, of course, vary by the type of cheating that we're talking about. Obviously, the sharing of test banks is going to be more of an entry-level thing. But with everything else, with sharing information, this really surfaces on promotional exams. And, of course, it's a longer time frame that we're talking about. You have one entry-level exam and maybe the course of dozens of promotional opportunities over the course of your career. And so there's just more opportunities there as well.
Okay. Got another one here relating to technology. What are some of the new cheating methods with technology?
So we've seen
things methods beyond what you all have mentioned?
I know that when we were talking about police, the fact that it used to be CD-ROM and then it evolved to text messaging, we're at a point now where we're still seeing some of these text message cases and still some of these cell phone cases, but determining where they're going to go next, we haven't seen those cases emerge yet. And based on the way that technology is hiding information better and better, it's probably going to be much more difficult to detect. And we know that technology moves so much faster than any agency can realistically keep up with. And so we haven't seen these cases being litigated yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if people are already using different messaging apps or they're using some sort of other capabilities with their cell phone. There's just too many options out there. And so that's why it's especially important, I think, for departments to be proactive in learning what's out there in terms of functionality. We mentioned Snapchat. I don't think Snapchat is going to be your biggest enemy. But if that's what everybody's using at your agency, then that's something you need to look at.
Yeah, for the technology side, I would go to the root and say, what is it that's allowing them to cheat? And it's communication. And so that's basically what you'd probably look at as the foundation for the start of your deterrent is how are they sharing communication? Because if you control your test site, don't bring in any phones, then it goes back to what technology is going to allow them to communicate with somebody else or some information to where they're going to be able to cheat. Because technology is constantly advancing, and Ari will go into more depth with that next week. But the foundation is communication. So just take a look at that. What's currently out there that they can use to cheat with technology when it comes to communication?
Great. Thanks, guys. Got another one here. Any thoughts on generating different tests for each candidate?
So the experience I've had with that is during probationary testing, where, and I had a very large organization, so I might have 12 captains on probation at one time. So if they're all coming in for their probationary testing, they would call around and say, hey, what were you tested on for the skills portion? And there would be a dozen evolutions that they had. Well, it was always looked at as, well, we have to test everybody the same. So what I did is I ran it by our legal and our HR department, and I said, what if I categorize each type of evolution into a different category and then did a random selection for that each one of those categories? And legal said it was okay. So obviously you want to check with them and your state laws, but if we were able to pull it off in California, it's probably something that other agencies can use. And so basically the candidates would come in and they would pick, a structure fire hose evolution. They would draw a number out of a hat, and that would correspond with a structure fire hose evolution. So they could have called another probationary captain, but that they would have had a completely different evolution potentially. And so that was the only way I've ever been able to do it where it was something different for each candidate, but the test has to be fair. And so when you do that, it has to be very, very tightly controlled, and you have to make sure that it's going to be fair. That's because anything can be litigated, and so any cracks you have in the process will open you up to that. So just if you're going to come up with a process like that, it's much more challenging, but the results, I think, might be better if you can get it to fly.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some value to that. But if I'm a plaintiff's attorney, as Clive is pointing out, you're looking for any cracks whatsoever. And so if I'm able to ascertain that of the 20 exercises, my client has had more difficult questions than other people on the exam, and that's really the reason that they want promoted, I'm going to target that, and I'm going to say, maybe it wasn't random, and try to poke holes in that. So, again, there's value if it's done correctly.
Okay. Then we've got a question here about using consultants. What are the benefits and the downsides to hiring a consultant to conduct testing versus doing it all internally?
So I'll go with my experiences on that. So there's some big upsides to using a consultant. The main downside is the cost. They cost tens of thousands of dollars at times. But from my experience in hiring consultants, their test material that they prepare for you is usually gone through the litigation side to make sure it's bulletproof. When I say litigation, I mean they've gone through to make sure they cannot be sued over the material. I mean, anybody can sue for anything, but theirs is usually very tight. And so they're very good at making their tests lawsuit-proof. The other thing is you have to look at your workload. Preparing a test is extremely labor-intensive, as Gerry pointed out. And so if you bring them in, typically what they'll do is they'll ask you what you want to build a test on. And so you give them all the parameters, and they put it together. And so, I mean, I know as a chief officer, I've always got 1,000 different things going on, and so that workload was a huge factor. The other benefit is usually they'll have connections. And so if they want to bring in these outside proctors, they might have some go-to people they know that are very good at proctoring tests, and they know that they're very high integrity and they're not going to share the information. And so these consultants might have good connections with other agencies to bring in chief officers that are going to be your biggest help. The other benefit I've seen is the consistency. And so if you use the same consultant, which we did in my previous organization in Contra Costa County, we knew that he was going to put on a good test, and our candidates, our employees, knew what they would expect. And then when I say what they would expect, it wasn't that they would know the answers. It was just that it was a good process that they knew they'd be able to follow, and so there wasn't going to be any issues with misunderstandings. It was going to be them going in, taking a familiar process and answering the best they can. And so I found a lot of upsides to consultants. And again, the main downside I would say was the cost. So, if it costs $30,000 to put on a test, you have to weigh that on, okay, that's $30,000, but how much of my time is that going to save, and what's a lawsuit going to cost if I write a test and it ends up getting sued? So I always lean towards using a consultant if I can afford it.
And I would add to that just that if you're going to use a consultant, don't cut corners. It's only going to be as good as the consultant is. You can equally imagine a scenario where you hire a poor consultant or one who's not as well vetted, and some other organization that they've worked with has the test poked at, right? Some attorney goes after it, they find that it's discriminatory. All of a sudden, that immediately transfers over to you, and it has implications in your organization. So don't try to cut corners with a consultant. If you can afford it, then I think Clive's highlighting all of the benefits. But a bad consultant can make things considerably worse for you.
Great point. You get what you pay for.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, guys. We're right about the end time here. We've got one last question/comment here, and so maybe we can use that as a final thought. The comment was that integrity is a cultural and systemic issue, and then the question is then how do you teach integrity, and what do you do to stress integrity as a basis for the public safety profession?
I always found leading by example. You recognize that if you ever cut corners, if you ever compromise your integrity, it's going to take years to correct. So starting at the leadership, you have to lead by example, and that trickles down through the ranks. As a battalion chief, even if there's something I didn't agree with that came from the higher up administration, I took ownership of it. I went to my staff. As a battalion chief, I had 9 stations I was responsible for. And so I would go to them and say, this is what we're doing, and I would explain and articulate why it's best for us and for ultimately the citizens. And so the integrity question, I'm always going to go back to the leadership of the organization, and they have to lead by example of a high moral and integrity standard.
Yeah, I think that's a good question and a great thought. I know lawyers are not the paradigm of ethical conduct always. But I know that the Watergate scandal, before the Watergate scandal, lawyers were not required to have any code of ethics or be tested on this sort of thing, and a lot of the blame for Watergate fell upon lawyers, whereafter now all of a sudden we have ethical conducts, we have to get tested on these things, and so I would add that maybe we can take away something from that, and that make sure that your organization has some sort of code of ethics. Obviously make sure that from the top down it's being adhered to, but make sure you have that code of ethics, and maybe even think about testing folks on that to make sure that they've read it, that they've understood it, that they've acknowledged it. Having that code of ethics can really go a long way.
Good deal. Thank you, guys. That's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank Gerry and Clive for providing their expertise and experience with all of us, and I'd like to thank all of you for attending. So that's it. Please join us next week for the second in this important series on high-stakes testing as we discuss how you can improve the integrity of your exam process and reduce the likelihood of cheating. Have a great afternoon.